Welcome to this latest episode on Forecast Direct, where we have a conversation with experts on matters of US and California economies. Today, we are honored to have our guest, Alina Arefeva, with us. She is an assistant professor of real estate at the Wisconsin School of Business. Before that, she taught at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. Her research studies the interaction of institutions and economic policies with real estate and urban markets. She has a publication in Economics Letters and another forthcoming in Management Science. She has working papers at Journal of Banking and Finance and Economic Modeling. Welcome, Alina. Today, we will primarily speak about her working paper titled Discrimination During Eviction Moratoria. And then towards the end, we will also briefly talk about one of her other working papers, Can Stay-at-Home Orders Create a Pandemic Housing Boom? So starting with discrimination during eviction moratoria, Alina, can you share with us what was the motivation for this study? What led you to explore the topic of eviction moratorium and focus on discrimination emanating from that?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. My original motivation for really all my research, but including this paper, is that every person has a place to call home. And, one impediment to that is discrimination, of course. Even though we had a Fair Housing Act a long time ago, we still can see discrimination at different stages of housing markets, starting from search, going through negotiations of rental prices, appraisals, and there's a lot of discussions of discrimination in the mortgage markets as well. And, recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, thus in general, housing insecurity and discrimination came to the forefront because everybody had to stay home to decrease possibility of further infections. And of course, it was hard to do if you didn't have a home. So a lot of the countries and states implemented eviction moratoria as kind of the main policy to allow people to stay homes. And, you would think that this is something that helping minorities and lower income families to, have secure housing. But what we actually are thinking about is that this potentially could increase discrimination. So to kind of address this question, we looked at this largest correspondence study that was conducted by Peter Christensen and also Ignacio Sarmiento-Barberi and Chris Timmings. So we've taken this data from spring and summer of 2020, where the computer bot was basically sending inquiries to places that were listed for rent on largest housing platform in the US from different fictitious identities. So they selected the names to make sure that the name is evoked in association with specific race. And so we can see responses of the same property manager to, white sounding names, African American sounding names, and Hispanic names. And we use that setup to with the new data that we collect on the eviction moratoria across different states in the US to see, what's happening with discrimination across 50 largest cities in the US.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. And what are your primary findings from there? And how does this finding that you have about discrimination in housing search contribute to the literature in this field that's already present?
Yeah, so unfortunate finding is that we do actually see intensified discrimination during the eviction moratoria, which is unfortunate because the policy was originally intended to help those renters who are housing insecure, which a lot of the minorities are. And so you can see that they're actually the ones who are suffering. So there's this intended consequence. And in terms of the quantitative findings, we see that outside of eviction moratoria, the African American names receive responses in 96% of the times relative to whites. But then when the eviction moratoria is in place, that drops to 89%. So we can see there's a bigger disparity during the eviction moratoria, which is our main finding. But we'll also look at some of the kind of more heterogeneity results. For example, we look at what's happening with gender discrimination, and we see that African American males are the ones who especially suffer from this increase in discrimination.
I see. That's a very interesting finding and quite a significant gap, unfortunately. Did you find any differences in these results across different geographies? Because you mentioned studying different geographical variations. So were there any differences there?
Yeah, absolutely. So without even thinking about eviction moratorium itself, the correspondent study found that the relative responses to African Americans were much worse in large cities such as Chicago, Los Angeles, Louisville, Minneapolis. So they were much worse than some of the other cities. On the other side of the spectrum, we have kind of those cities, Columbus, Phoenix, Jacksonville, and so forth. So that's a regional study, but now coming to think about eviction moratoria itself and the interaction with eviction moratoria, what we do is take this really interesting index from Stephen Davidson, who looked at the percent of Google searches that are using the racially charged language across different geographies in the US. Mm-hmm. And so we take this index and look at what's happening with discrimination during eviction moratoria in places where that index is high, which we think that would be places with kind of prejudice towards minorities, and where it's low. And we see that this pickup in discrimination that we're finding is basically happening in those places where that index is high, right? So that's one geographic dimension. Another geographic dimension that we look at is places with high and low rent. And beyond, kind of obvious motivation of looking at high and low rents, our idea is that when rents are high, the payoff, or the cost of selecting non-paying tenant is really high. And so if you think that the reason why there's discrimination is the statistical discrimination with landlord trying to just use statistic for different racial groups to infer what is the credibility of that specific tenant, then in places with high rents, mistaken selecting a bad tenant is really high. And that's why we do this geographic comparison. And we find that in places with high rents, that intensified discrimination is especially bad, which kind of tells us, yes, it's possible that the reason why discrimination was intensified is the statistical explanation. And in some sense, it's a little bit unsatisfying. So we kind of find that there's support for, several potential explanations for what's happening. So it could be prejudice. It could be this, statistical discrimination.
I see. You also have a housing model talking about search. I know that these models can usually be very complicated to understand, but just for our audience, can you explain in very simple, brief terms what the model that you're using is and how you incorporate moratorium and discrimination within that?
Absolutely. The reason why we have a model in the first place is just to conceptualize this intuitive explanation of why discrimination is worse. So basically, we're saying, if discrimination existed in the first place, then when the landlord is unable to evict non-paying tenants, it's going to get worse, right? In terms of the theoretical structure, we assume there are minorities and whites, and then landlord has the unit to lease. If the unit is actually leased, the tenant pays the rent as we normally have in the market. But we assume that happens with some probability. And this probability, could be potentially different for different types of tenants. And if we think that the landlord believes that it's lower for minority tenants because of statistics potentially, that would be a statistical discrimination in the model conceptually. And aside from the rent, landlord normally pays maintenance costs. And here, what we can do is incorporate prejudice or taste-based discrimination by saying that the maintenance cost would be higher for minorities relative to whites if for some reason landlord doesn't like minority tenants.
Okay.
And so altogether, we kind of have this setup where landlord gets rent with some probability, has to pay maintenance costs, and then it's up to the tenant. So if the tenant is actually paying rent, the tenant stays in the unit for another month or year. If not, that's where normally landlord can actually evict the tenant and kind of restart the process. So put the unit on the market. And this is where kind of we connect this to the experiment, because we can say, okay, once the landlord has the unit on the market, we can monitor inquiries from new potential tenants and see what is the probability of replying to minority tenants relative to white tenants. And of course, this process is costly and it's a little bit random, so we kind of incorporate that into the model, but even given this randomness and search costs, still the fundamentals are tenants actually paying the rent. So we still are looking at what is the payoff of leasing to minority tenant relative to white tenant. So that's kind of the basic setup. Now moratorium. So to introduce moratorium, we say that if the tenant is not paying, this is when moratorium matters, because the landlord is prohibited from evicting the tenant in that situation. So that means that the landlord has to bear, a period where the rent is not paid, but the maintenance costs are still due. And moreover, you cannot release the unit. So you have to postpone really, putting it on the market for the next tenant. So you can see that, that definitely reduces incentives of the landlord to, lease to a tenant who can potentially be a non-paying tenant. And that means that if the landlord originally thought that minority tenants either are less likely to pay or just are not desirable because of prejudice, the eviction moratorium will just make it worse, right? So we're going to get lower responses to minorities, and that's exactly what we find in the actual experimental evidence.
I see. And there are lots of housing search models, just housing models also in general, in this field. Have you found, so what you have found, is it significantly different from what has been found before? Is it new in the sense that what you are doing has not exactly been done before? Can you just give us what the scope of your research is in terms of the broad literature here?
Yeah, I from my understanding, we're the first paper to look at the interaction of discrimination and eviction moratoria, especially from the point of view of actual empirical evidence with a randomized experiment and thinking about the search process that is kind of connected to that experimental evidence.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I guess you have paved the path for a lot more new research on this topic. What does this research mean in terms of policy prescription? Because we know that the eviction moratorium was intended to help people, as we were discussing in the beginning. But it turns out from your findings that it's actually increasing discrimination. So what would you ask of the policymakers in terms of helping with the eviction moratorium and discrimination?
Yeah, that's exactly things we're thinking about in terms of for that's motivation for this research. And the straightforward policy recommendation would be to make sure that the fair housing laws are enforced more strictly if we have to have eviction moratorium. But I think this is where further research is really important because what we are looking at is increased discrimination for people who are looking to rent, so, minorities or whites. But it's possible that those minorities who already are in the units are benefiting from having eviction moratorium in place. And so we really need, a structural framework where we can weigh the costs of increased discrimination with benefits of having eviction moratoria in the first place. So we are hoping to, spur further discussion here so that we can actually address this question.
Okay. Very interesting again. Let's move on a little bit to one of your other working papers. Can stay-at-home orders create a pandemic housing boom? Can you explain a motivation of that and just briefly explain what you are planning to do in there? Because I know that eviction moratorium was not the only policy that affected housing during COVID. There were other policies that also unintentionally affected the housing market in the US. So can you just briefly explain your other paper working with stay-at-home orders?
Yeah, with pleasure. So there we were looking at shutdowns that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, or stay-at-home orders, whatever you prefer. And the reason why we wanted to look at this is because these shutdowns were really hard on those home buyers and sellers who were in the market to buy or sell a home, which is because the in-person viewings were very restricted. In some places, realtors wouldn't even show you a home during this time to, comply with the stay-at-home order. And this weird situation is a good natural experiment to think about what happens with the market if the search is impeded. So the way we think about it is by looking at variation in the start and ends of the stay-at-home orders, and trying to use that geographic variation by zooming into county borders, where on one side we had the stay-at-home order, and on the other side it was not yet implemented. And these differences are really, several days, a week, if not less. And because it's, pretty close in terms of timing, and because we control for a lot of things that are related to potential changes in housing demand or housing supply, all of this is in the paper. Because of this, we can really identify the effect of the stay-at-home order itself. And when we do that empirically, we'll find that house prices are higher, the sellers take longer time to sell a home. At the same time, sales are down and number of listings is also down. And so the way we can explain all of this is by looking at impeded housing search. So buyers having a harder time finding homes, sellers having a harder time finding buyers for their homes. So if that's the case, you can see how that would increase the seller's time on the market. Of course, if the seller cannot sell quickly, the seller will only list if the seller is compensated by a higher price. And because nothing is selling fast, we would have lower sales and also listings. So that's how we think about it from theory perspective. And as I mentioned, we control for a lot of demand and supply factors, and also this is like really difference in the days. So it shouldn't be due to those factors. But even if you think it is, still could be due to housing demand and supply, or supply. With higher housing demand, we would see higher sales, right? That's kind of like our Econ 101. With lower supply, which you think could be a problem during that time, we would see quick sales. So time in the market for sellers should drop. So that means that none of this can really be explained by standard factors, and it's really the impeded search. And because we find that, we think that it's really important to account for, liquidity issues in the housing market and how the search process works when we think about, implementing these policies and potential unintended consequences of these policies.
For sure. This is really interesting. And again, I think the work that you are doing and you are about to be doing in this field is going to help a lot of other researchers just understand housing in general and housing search models in particular, because as you were explaining, it's very complicated. A lot of things need to be incorporated for it to be realistic. Anyway, it was a great discussion with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to share my research with UCLA Forecast Direct. It's an amazing audience. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much to the audience for tuning in. We are looking forward to the next episode of Forecast Direct. Thank you.